Let me just begin by giving a quick thumbnail sketch of what I mean by Orthodox social thought, and then we'll get into actually talking about Eastern Orthodox social thought. And just for those of you wondering, I'm Ukrainian Orthodox, so I have strong opinions about what's going on in Eastern Europe, all of which I edited out of this talk. But social thought in Catholic and Protestant circles arise with the Enlightenment and with the spread of democracy and then the growth of the free market and technological changes, all of which brought with it new social problems that the Christian community needed somehow to deal with, how to respond. And especially early on, things like democracy were not always well received. Orthodox social thought, though it comes to the party a little bit later, is really also basically concerned with just that. How do we preach the gospel in the contemporary world facing challenges that are unique to our era? I'm a chaplain at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and UW-Madison is a research institution, and it is a place where religion has almost wholly been removed. And so I work with students on a regular basis who are having to go through classwork and prepare for their careers in a really non-religious environment. And it's quite a challenge for them, not because people are getting up and saying you're bad because you're an Orthodox Christian or you're bad because you're a Christian, though that happens, but mostly because they're in a context in which religious concerns are simply not ever expressed. They're not part of the conversation. And so the kids learning how to deal with that is sort of its own kind of challenge. So, and that really gets me to the two concerns of Orthodox thought, social thought, is how do I respond in love and justice to the concerns that I see around me? And that implies an even more basic question is how do I identify what the concerns are? How do I know what is important? What is something that the church needs to respond to? And that sounds kind of self-evident, but if you notice, if you listen around us, we often have great disagreements about what exactly we should be responding to. Not just how we should respond, but what's actually worth our time. Recently, the Orthodox Church has issued two, what I'm calling magisterial statements on social thought. The first was published in 2000 by the Moscow Patriarchate. It's called The Basis of the Social Concept of the Orthodox Church. And that document was published just after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the church in Russia was trying to help navigate all of the great social changes that were going on in the former Soviet Union. The other document is called For the Life of the World, Towards an Orthodox Social Ethos, and that was published in 2020 and it was written by a committee of primarily American scholars, Orthodox scholars, and was later revised and expanded by a committee of bishops of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. That second document, For the Life of the World, as well as Basis, really covers most of the material, the kinds of themes and topics that you would find, say, in the Compendium of Catholic Social Thought, Social Teaching, published by the Church of Rome. Where the second document, For the Life of the World, is unique is that while it covers much of the same ground as the Russian document, it does so from a slightly different perspective. The Russian document is more, I would call, a conservative document. It's more concerned with laying out the foundations for a free market and the rule of law. The second document, For the Life of the World, is offered really rather intentionally as a critique of the first document, and it tends to be a more politically, though not culturally, progressive document. Neither document covers a lot of new ground, though the second document for the life of the world does make what I would consider to be some rather ill-advised policy recommendations. In the interest of full disclosure, I don't think clergy should talk about policy. We shouldn't make policy recommendations. We are free, of course, to critique the morality of a policy, but we should not be telling legislatures how to vote or what kind of policy to put in place. That's not our job, and that we can talk about that in the Q&A if you'd like, but it gets us into bad places. All right, so we're going to talk about 4 things this morning, and that's going to be Orthodox theological anthropology of ordered freedom. And if you've been at Acton a while, you've probably heard that phrase, ordered freedom, a lot. I know Sam Gregg likes to talk about it. So we're going to talk about ordered freedom in the tradition of the Orthodox Church. Then we're going to talk about the relationship between church and state, and then economic liberty. And then I'm going to conclude by talking a little bit about the character of Orthodox social witness. And just to give you just to anticipate, in both documents, we're told that Orthodox social witness should be kenotic or self-emptying. For those of you who have read Scripture a lot, if you remember Paul's epistle to the Philippians, he says of the incarnation, though he was in the form of God, Jesus does not deem equality with God something to be grasped at. Rather, he empties himself and takes the form of a slave. That idea of the incarnation being a self-emptying act on the part of God becomes for Orthodox Christians the touchstone of our social witness, at least ideally. So are you with me? Okay. This is usually a part where I tell people that before I was a priest, I worked with, I was a school teacher, and then I was a lead therapist for a day treatment program with juvenile offenders. So I have to confess, I get anxious when people are quiet. If you're in a group setting with juveniles and everyone's quiet, you do know that something bad is about to happen and you are the object of that badness. So let's keep a good thought that no one here is carrying. So let's talk a little bit about Orthodox anthropology of ordered freedom. The freedoms of the political and the economic arenas are important, and they certainly have their role to play not only in human flourishing, but also in the pursuit of Christian holiness. And I think sometimes we fall into the habit of thinking that these, because they're secondary, they're unimportant, but they are important. It is important for us to be able to choose and to make decisions that allow us to change. St. Gregory of Nyssa, writing in the early church, puts it this way: true perfection is this, to never stop growing towards that which is better and never placing any limit on perfection. There is this idea in Orthodox theological anthropology that the perfection of the human is found precisely in our ability to change and to change frequently. And the direction of our change is towards Jesus Christ. Our freedom is not meant to be, in other words, a series of open-ended decisions. That's always a difficult thing to help undergraduates. I'm a college chaplain. Understand. It's like, no, it's not just that you get to pick anything. You have to make the right choices. You have to make the right picks. Understanding that those choices are always provisional and need to be revisited later on. But freedom is also not just a series or just the absence of constraint. I sometimes will work with the libertarian group in Madison. I love libertarians. I go to their events, and they're always happy to see me because evidently clergy don't like them. So people buy me beer. But it is a little bit like herding cats, to be honest, because nobody wants to make a decision that, in any way impinges upon the freedom of others. That's really not a particularly good definition of freedom, just to talk about no constraints. We make choices daily, and these are important, but like I said a moment ago, they're not ends in themselves. They're rather in the service of what Gregory calls that ordered and purposeful change of growing in holiness. Moreover, this purposeful and ordered change is rooted in human nature. In the opening lines of For the Life of the World, we hear this. The Orthodox Church understands the human person as having been created in the image and likeness of God. To be made in God's image is to be made for free and conscious communion and union with God in Jesus Christ, inasmuch as we are formed in, through, and for Him. This life of communion, they go on to say, is built on prayer and action, derived from loving and reverent gratitude for life and the gifts that God imparts to us through His Son and in His Spirit. Our service to God is fundamentally doxological in nature and essentially Eucharistic in character. They go on to quote St. Basil the Great, who says that the doxological character of human nature means that we only exercise our freedom in the full sense, to say nothing of becoming ourselves more fully, when we look up and see God, worshiping Him and acknowledging Him as our source and origin. Now, since God is also a Trinity, a communion of three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, a life of personal communion with the Trinity also necessarily includes a life of communion with our neighbors. Human life then is necessarily, we would say, Eucharistic in character, since it is only in and through our participation together in the community of Christ's body that any of us, as a unique object of divine love, can enter into full union with God. In the Orthodox Church, or the Orthodox understanding of things, the Church actually represents that alternative society that stands, we'll hear about it later on, in judgment over the world, not necessarily so much in what we say, but in fact who we are. But in any case, for now, our ordered freedom means to grow in communion with God through Jesus Christ as a member of the Church, and that this is fulfilled most fully in this life in the celebration of the Eucharist. You with me? Okay. So, as a consequence of all this, Christians are called not to accommodate ourselves to the practical exigencies of the world as we find it, but instead to strive against evil, however invincible it may appear, and to work for the love and justice that God requires of His creatures, however impractical that may at times prove. This isn't meant to dismiss prudence or technical expertise, nor is it meant to be a rejection of culture and human affairs in favor of some sort of liturgical sectarianism. But it is to say that we cannot lose sight of our primary obligation to bless, elevate, and transfigure the world so that its intrinsic goodness may be revealed even amidst its fallenness. So we have to have a certain kind of detachment from the things that are going on around us, not because they're unimportant, but because we want to point people and institutions to something which is greater, which is the kingdom of God. Now, living as we do in a fallen world, exercising our freedom in love may on many occasions, the authors go on to say, take the form of a call to pursue God's goodness even to the point of self-sacrifice. We cannot preclude martyrdom as not simply a possibility if we take seriously the Christian vocation, but something which is desirable. It is martyrdom, we would say, where the exercise of our ordered liberty in the gospel inevitably arrives. And the easiest example of that in a world where you're not suffering a violent death is simply when we die. When we die, the late Vladimir Losky says, what we should do at that moment, or be able to do, is to surrender our lives freely to God, rather than struggling against death, we accept it with gratitude and peace. But one more thing, this self-sacrifice is inevitably also an ascetical labor. And what I mean by asceticism is the life of prayer, fasting, almsgiving, and manual labor, by which we struggle against sinfulness, not only our own sinfulness, but the sinfulness that we see around us. I was at a conference in Florida, I think last September, and I was talking with a group of people about the Jesus prayer, and one young man, a pastor, said, well, I changed the Jesus prayer from Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, to Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on my situation or my relationship with my mother-in-law. I said, what do you think about that? I said, well, I like to say I'm a sinner. Well, what about, a mercy on my relationship with my mother-in-law? I said, well, I'm the problem in my relationship with my mother-in-law. That really is it. So asceticism is simply the acknowledgement of the fact that before you're the problem, I'm the problem. And before I'm going to be able to struggle against sin around me, I have to struggle against sin within me. So let's shift now, if we can, and talk about the relationship between church and state. And the thing I want you to take away from this first thing is that in Orthodox theology, the state has only a provisional or a providential value. The state was not something that was willed by God at the beginning. It's something that arises later in human history after the fall. But it nevertheless has a providential character because the existence of the state allows us to strive together against sin. Okay, got it? Like I said, the emergence of the state is providential. It happens fairly late in human history, but it allows us, we hear in the basis of the social concept of the church, to struggle, to order our social lives and our freedom so that we respond to the earthly reality of sin through opposing it by temporal power. So this is what we are supposed to do as in our life in the state. In light of this, the basis quotes both St. Paul and St. Peter that Christians are obligated to obey civil authority regardless of their attitude to the church. This is something of a hard sell these days in America. And it certainly was a hard sell during the COVID restrictions. Many of my parishioners were quite irritated with me by saying, no, I think that the regulations are probably imprudent and unjust, but that doesn't really matter. We still have to obey them because that's what we do. We obey Caesar. And that comes out of a context in Peter and Paul when Christians were being actively persecuted and martyred. Again, that's kind of a hard sell in an American context, but we do owe that level of obedience as long as we are not being compelled to worship falsely. The reason for that is that we read in the basis that God blesses the state as an essential element of life in the world distorted by sin. In our fallen world, they go on to say, both the individual and society as a whole need to be protected from those who would harm others. That said, for the life of the world, they respond by saying, yes, the state does have a provisional character, it's providential, but our obedience, there is a limit on our obedience. One of the things you discover if you read a lot of Orthodox social thought, especially the stuff that comes out of the magisterial stuff, is that there is not necessarily the kind of unanimity that you would see, say, in the Catholic Church. We have a lot more back and forth. They say for the life of the world, Christians should avoid the attempts to make the state absolute. We must also recognize the limits of the state and its purely earthly, temporal, and transient value, conditioned by the presence of sin in the world and the need to restrain it. I'm sorry, that's from the basis. It's especially important here that Christians and those of goodwill bear in mind that just as other human institutions, the state, even if aimed at the good, may tend to transform into a self-sufficing institution, usurping the place of God in human affairs. This is why, in For the Life of the World, while talking about the need to be obedient to the state, they also talk about the need to be prudent in our obedience and not to romanticize the state. In Orthodox theology and our church-state relationships, we have the concept of symphonia, from which we get the word symphony. And this idea that church and state, in their own realms, have their own authority and ideally should cooperate. For the Life of the World comes along and says, we know that's true, but we need to be careful about that. Because sometimes what has happened is that the church has surrendered her freedom, surrendered her authority to the concerns of the state. And I wasn't, but this is what, arguably is happening now with the Moscow Patriarchate and the invasion of Ukraine. The Patriarch of Moscow has now offered theological justification for what is, pretty clearly an unjust invasion. The church needs to be very careful about how we relate to the state. Yes, be obedient, but make sure that obedience doesn't cause us to betray Christ. And in an Orthodox context, that primarily happens because we tend to romanticize the past. You haven't lived until you've spoken with someone who's been Orthodox for 6 months, who remembers the fall of Constantinople as if he were there. We are very good at that. All that said, we need to be careful that we don't look at every kind of government as equivalent. All governments are fallen, but not all have fallen as far. So there needs to be some prudence involved in our critique of government. We may not like, Churchill, democracy is the worst form of government except for the alternatives. That's very much the idea here. We owe the state obedience, but we need to be wise in our obedience. We should critique the state, but we should understand that we don't live in the world of abstraction. So we shouldn't just simply dismiss all forms of government as an offense against freedom. This brings us then to the question of the freedom of religion. And in the history of the Orthodox Church, church has lived and flourished in all sorts of governments, all sorts of regimes. Not only the Roman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire, time of the czars, communism. I'm a social scientist by profession, and the thing that sort of intrigues me the most about the church under different governments is that it seems that the government that has given us the most difficulty is actually democracy. Like every other religious tradition in America, we have a very hard time holding on to our own faithful. It seems as if the one government that is most corrosive to faith is the government that strives to foster personal freedom. All that said, though, to come back, For the Life of the World, they do fundamentally value the separation of church and state for the reasons I talked about a moment ago, that while the close cooperation of throne and altar was often a blessing for the church, it came at a very high price, and that was the tendency of the gospel would be compromised because of concerns of civil authority. So it is very much in the interest of the church, they go on to say, that the institutional association of Christianity with the interests of the states be as tenuous as possible. So ideally, we want to keep a distance from the state. And not because of anything on behalf of the state, but because we want to make sure that we don't compromise our evangelical witness by being seen as a shill for the state. Finally, when we talk about the relationship of church and state, and I've mentioned this before, is that Orthodox social teaching is very self-conscious that whatever we say must necessarily be provisional. And the reason it's provisional goes back to what St. Gregory of Nyssa said, is that the perfection of the human is found in our ability to change. Because human life is dynamic, these kinds of practical social questions only allow us to come up with provisional, open-ended answers. I may not like the fact that same-sex marriage is now the law of the land, but I have to deal with it. And what I would have said before is not necessarily what I say today. Not because the morality of same-sex marriage has changed, but the circumstances have now changed. And again, I'm a college chaplain, and just a quick example, many of the students I work with, not you, others that come through over the years, they've just accepted same-sex marriage as an unalloyed good. So I don't really make any progress by saying, oh, it's wicked and evil, because they just don't think like that anymore. I have to start somewhere else. You get the idea? So we have to remember that our social teaching has to be open-ended, and it also then requires that we be willing to have conversations with people who may disagree with us. So let's switch now to economic liberty, and I'm keeping an eye on the time. This for me is really sort of the interesting thing, because this is where the two documents really diverge rather dramatically. Like I said a moment ago, Basis of the Social Concept, that it comes out in 2000, is basically the church trying to lay the moral and theological foundation for the economic reforms that are happening in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. And they're trying to explain to people why a free market is a great thing, why property rights are a great thing. And they have some absolutely lovely and beautiful things to say on these very issues. They talk about how, where is it? Sorry, I got enthused by, it's very rare for me to get enthused by what Russian bishops say these days. So I kind of enjoy it when it happens, It's, they talk about the necessity of private property, the rule of law, and they go on to tell the reader that wealth cannot make us happy, but the problem is when wealth becomes an end in itself. This is not about saying that wealth is going to make us happy, but we need to have property rights, we need to have the rule of law so that our economic life can be just. And without them, then we begin to suffer what they call the complete degradation of society. That said, the Russian bishops are also very critical of what was current in Russia at the time and is now current in America as well, with this idea that the social safety net, which is a good thing, be transformed or degraded into a promise of providing people with a specific material standard of living. And the idea here is that when the state provides people with basically a guaranteed income, the state usurps the place of God in the life of the individual, usurps the individual's freedom, but it also fosters in the individual a tendency to be self-contained. if the state gives me the money I need to live, then I really don't need you. I don't have to go to work. I don't have to work with customers or please an employer. I can just do what I want. So they see in these, what today we call universal guaranteed or universal basic income, a temptation to subsidize self-absorption and sort of spiritual narcissism. Again, all that said though, got to come back to that in the scriptures, wealth is still a blessing. If you know, well, we'll get to that, maybe the question answers, but wealth is a blessing, and the owner of considerable wealth, they say, does not sin simply by being rich. But we do need to learn how to use our wealth properly. The document also talks about different kinds of property, corporate, private, as well as mixed, more abstract forms like intellectual property. And again, they say the same thing. All of this can be used for good or evil depending upon the disposition of individuals. Most importantly, though, of all, is that material and cultural wealth be protected as a matter of law, so that people can use it properly. And then they say something very strange. The church declares that the income drawn through entrepreneurial activity can be taxed, but any encroachment on the donation of believers is a crime before people and God. The state can tax, the state can regulate wealth and property, but if someone gives the church money, the state's not allowed to have anything to do with that. I want you to hold that in the back of your head for just a minute, because I'll come back to it. When we go from the basis for the life of the world, the question of economics changes, the discussion of economics changes radically. The section on economics is the second longest in the document, and it is something, it raises issues with which I am not unsympathetic. It criticizes crony capitalism, the excesses and failures of globalism, the need for the free international movement of workers, their right to organize, calls for the protection of the environment, and extending health care to all. All of these things are certainly good and desirable, but the problem is that in almost 5,000 words, the authors have not one good thing to say about economic freedom. It is frankly Manichaean. If you have wealth, you're evil. So we need to take all that evil wealth and give it to people who don't have it, which makes no sense morally. They're yeah. You know, they make one begrudging concession that possibly imprudent taxation on private institutions can result in job loss. That's the closest they come in almost 5,000 words to anything positive. Like I said, the economic vision sketched out here is really simply Manichaean. And any early praise of freedom or of the necessity of staying independent of the state goes out the window. They see no value for economic freedom. They see no value for regulatory touch on the part of government. It is frankly very much, it's basically socialism. Since the authors aren't named, but since the primary author for this section is likely David Bentley Hart, who is himself an Orthodox theologian and socialist, it's probably Hart's stuff. Maybe I think more importantly, the document ignores all the economic and material progress that we've seen, even since the 1950s. It's simply not addressed. It's simply ignored, and they just do it. It's like I said, it took me a long time to write this section because I just didn't have anything that wasn't harsh to say. And like I said a moment ago, they also ignore all of the dangers of state encroachment in the economy. And this is, I think, one of the great weaknesses of Orthodox social thought. And we saw it a moment ago when we talked about the Church of Russia saying, if people give money to the church, the state can't touch it. There is this tendency, I think, sometimes in Orthodox theology, when we talk about social issues, to engage in a kind of special pleading. It's money, you gave the money to Christ, so you can't touch it. Well, we're prayerful and we're holy, and we have the best intentions, so we actually know what people should do. And we don't have to be bothered by technical considerations. We can just tell you what to do and then move on. All of this also, though, is rooted, I think, in a tendency, and we see this in other places as well, to conflate the personal preferences of the authors with the tradition of the church. I think the free market is a great thing. I really do. I would never get up and say, the tradition of the Orthodox Church requires as a moral imperative the free market. All right. The free market is supported by the tradition, but the tradition doesn't require that I be an Austrian economist. It supports me if I want to do it, but it doesn't make me do it. The tradition of the church might tell us that universal health care is a great thing, but contrary to what they say in For the Life of the World, none of the church fathers get up and say the state needs to provide health care for everyone, regardless of ability to pay. So again, this is a problem, and it's not just a problem with Orthodoxy. We tend to have our preferences, and we see them supported by the gospel, and now we want to make them mandatory for everyone. That harms our witness, to be perfectly honest. And that brings me to the last point. Social witness, in the Orthodox understanding, should ideally be self-emptying. It should be kenotic. And what do I mean by that? St. Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century is reflecting on the incarnation, and he says, I'm paraphrasing the saint, you know what was really quite extraordinary? God became man and then went about the business of wooing humanity. God, who loves us, desires our love. God wants us to love him. He sees value in our love. That all came crashingly clear to me at the beginning of the calendar year. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, which is ever so progressive. 25 square miles surrounded by reality. And we have a very divided state government. Democrats are the governor, executive branch. Republicans have the legislative branch. And the Republicans passed a whole list of pro-life measures, knowing very full well that the governor would then veto them. So it was a pointless exercise. No progress was made, but everyone felt much better about themselves for being on the right side. Whatever. I'm reading the governor's Facebook page. I'm friends with Governor Evers on Facebook. Me and like 8,000 other people, whatever. And I'm seeing all of the responses to his veto. And, it's Facebook. It might start out moderate, but, by about 15 down, it's hateful. And I'm reading this stuff, and I'm thinking to myself, Jesus says I have to love these people. Now, I had just read that article about St. Maximus. Okay, I'm going to love them. But by God, I'm not going to get close to them. I suddenly realized I didn't actually want these people to love me. What value is that to my witness? If I say, I love you, but stay over there. I'm going to love you from a distance. I'm going to pray for you, but I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to have you a part of my life. This is what the Orthodox Church means when we say that our social witness should be self-emptying. It isn't simply enough to tell people the truth. As I tell my own congregation, it may be true that you are ugly and your mother dresses you funny, which in my case is true. But if I tell you that, you're not going to be my friend. I'm just going to push you away. And the fact of the matter is, our social witness needs to be of a kind that encourages people to love us, because this is what God in Jesus Christ has done. He has gone out of his way to win our love, because our love is valuable to God. One of the reasons I think we have all of the divisiveness that we see now in American politics is precisely because we do not care to be loved by each other. We're happy to love the other side, we just don't want to be loved by them. My standard is basically this: I should not say, in a political context, something I would not say to my wife. I should not use a tone or an argument that I would not use with my wife. I love my wife. My wife is also a federal prosecutor, so there are two good reasons not to be polemical with my wife. But the fact of the matter is, whatever the point is of disagreement, the fact that my wife and I love each other matter more than that policy. And Orthodox social witness values public policy, but it understands that policy is always secondary. And it is secondary to the evangelical witness of the church. It is of no value to pass good legislation and undermine the gospel. Or as St. Basil says in one place, I have won the argument and lost the soul. So Orthodox social witness, again, values that policy, but with something maybe added.